Shalom, I am Rabbi Michael Panitz, and I have the honor to be speaking to you from the pulpit of Temple Israel in Norfolk, Virginia. Today I'm going to speak on the subject of theological criminal negligence, a serious topic for a serious time. This is a sad time for the Jewish people. We are within the Shiv'ah, the 7-day period of mourning after one of the worst accidents in the history of the modern state of Israel. At a festival gathering on Mount Meron, the burial site of a sainted early Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a crowd of holiday revelers came to grief. Descending on a steep and slippery ramp, some lost their footing, and people died from trampling and from asphyxiation. We've laid to rest 45 Jewish brothers and sisters who ought to be alive today. I will share with you both a first and a second response to this tragedy. Our first response, very simply, must be the classic Jewish response of mourning the dead and comforting the mourners. But what about our second response? Our second response should be to analyze the factors that caused the tragedy so as to avoid the deaths of others in analogous future situations. Here's where I want to speak to you about theological criminal negligence. Most people are not lawyers, but there is a widespread understanding of the concept of criminal negligence. The failure to use reasonable care to avoid consequences that threaten or harm the safety of the public and that are the foreseeable outcome of acting in a particular manner. That is the textbook definition of criminal negligence. I believe that the secular authorities in Israel who permitted the dangerous overcrowding at the festival site, who admitted 90,000 people to a space that was deemed by health and safety professionals to be adequate for only 10,000. Those authorities need to investigate whether there is criminal negligence here. Did the police fail to enforce safety regulations because of political pressure exerted by ultra-Orthodox Haredi society and its political sponsors? That has happened all too often in the past. But I leave the points of law to the legal professionals. Let me speak rather from the domain of religion. We should ponder this. Why do certain expressions of Judaism make a virtue of overcrowding? And let me add, a virtue of overcrowding even in the era of COVID-19. Again, what about certain forms of Judaism makes scorn for advice from secular sources, either medical or police, into a virtue? This is where theological criminal negligence comes into focus. Our classical rabbinic sources speak with awe about the massive packing of Jewish worshipers in sacred space, regarding it as a subject for miracles. One of the 10 miracles performed in the Jerusalem temple, according to the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 5, Mishnah 7, was Omdim tzifufim umishtachavim rivachim. The people stood pressed together and yet were able to kneel in prayer with ease. What that means, literally, is that they were crowded body to body with no space between them. And yet, when the time came to perform the full-length prostration, there was room for each person to do so. A miracle. I know there are some people who read that statement as a literally truthful piece of reportage. I myself read it not literally, but rather seriously, as a rabbinic statement of an ideal world where Jewish values would transcend the limitations of life as we know it into a new and messianic reality. Still, no matter how we understand the text, it is a window to a part of Jewish psychology that worshipers ideally have no social space at all separating them. Most of us have seen examples of this phenomenon in today's ultra-Orthodox Jewish world. If you've ever seen videos of the funerals of the leading rabbis of the Haredi community, you will recognize a sea of people. You have probably also experienced this sense of sacred congestion at the Kotel Plaza, the plaza in front of the western wall, the retaining wall of the Jerusalem temple. If you go there on a Friday evening for Shabbat Eve services, the religious yeshiva students come dancing in as the sun is setting, a conga line of men pressing forward with a dangerous momentum into an already congested space. It is dangerous because it is a combination of a maximum of self-righteousness and a minimum of concern about the welfare of anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in their path. This is not confined to religious circles. It is the sacred parallel to the undulating myriads of music lovers in mosh pits and the jostling soccer fans in the standing room only pens adjacent to the playing fields of British soccer venues. Psychologically, close proximity can produce mass euphoria. But euphoria, even when it's connected to spirituality, is not a valid religious reason to endanger life. Commenting on the biblical verse, Lo tinasu et Adonai Elohechem, do not put the Lord your God to the test, as you did at the waters of Massah. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. Commenting on that verse, the rabbis generalize the biblical injunction into a maxim about how we should live our lives. We need to exercise care and prudence and not rely upon God to save us from our lack of caution by performing a miracle. Don't rely on miracles, even if you do believe in them. Now, Israeli health officials cautioned that repeating the traditional gatherings of hundreds of thousands at Mount Meron this year, with worshipers drawn mostly from the Haredi community, where vaccination rates are lagging behind the rest of Israeli society, was to court an explosion of infection and perhaps fatal illness. We don't know yet whether that will occur, although we may get very disquieting news of that within the next week or two. But we do know that the ramps and walkways up and down the steep slope of the mountain have long been recognized to be an accident waiting to happen. What has taken this week is a tragedy, but not a surprise. Again, consider the definition of criminal negligence: the failure to use reasonable care to avoid consequences that threaten or harm the safety of the public, and that are the foreseeable outcome of acting in a particular manner. When learned rabbis and yeshiva deans, who know very well the primacy in Judaism of safeguarding life, nonetheless continue religious practices known to be potentially deadly, they are committing theological criminal negligence. They're the authorities for the young adult and adult students to a far greater degree than any non-Orthodox rabbi. A cardinal tenet of Jewish ethics is that with power comes responsibility. In a society that authorizes its religious leaders to issue dicta governing all aspects of the lives of their students and followers, it behooves them to remember that the first duty is to preserve life, a religious duty, and not only the dictate of an external secular authority. We have a situation where the memory of good old tradition is colored by a modern war against the so-called accursed Zionists. Yes, a war where disobeying an Israeli police officer is praised rather than condemned by the people at the apex of the subculture of Haredi Israeli society. I wish that these leaders could see how they've been carried away by the momentum of their war against modernity to be committing crimes before God. In our tradition, the first of all the rabbis was Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. And one of the most famous injunctions of Moses was and is, Uvacharta v'chayim. Therefore, choose life. It's time for us to choose life.